We've heard this afternoon about the role of research, and we've also seen wonderful examples of implementation. And I suppose my role is just to now try to look at the issue even probably as the last speaker more broadly. I think it's very clear that the EXUMAS has been the focus of our attention. I want to spend the next 20 minutes or so trying to argue for the relationship between processes of urbanization more broadly and the EXUMAS, and to suggest that it's impossible to really focus solely on the EXUMAS. Not that anyone has suggested that's what we would be doing, but that it's really imperative for us to look at the processes of urbanization, for example, within Nassau, as part of a certain set of sensibilities that in a way also relate to the EXUMAS, and therefore there is the need for a broader regional conceptualization of development and of thinking about the area, which then makes, in a sense, the research program, the work that one would do, much more integrated as an overall set of practices, rather than one kind of practice here and another kind of practice there. So I'm arguing for, in a sense, consistencies. The other thing that I'm like to focus on is really about the quality of things. And part of what I hope has been emphasized throughout the day is that we need to be, in many ways, producing the conditions, the circumstances that help us think in a different way. It's not as if we have always the capacity to think in a different way. So part of the way that, in a way, the field of design needs to construct its own discipline and its own discourses is to provide the appropriate circumstances, and therefore what are the ways in which we really create conditions for imagining in different ways. So that's also something else that I'd like to point out. And finally, I want to emphasize the relationship between, in a sense, the idea of focus on the EXUMAS or any other part of the world as being a focus also on the interrelationship between ethical practices and aesthetic practices. And that is an important issue in the sense that we heard this morning from the chief planner in the city here. And one of the things that comes up in relation to planning is that there are certain codes within which, for example, architectural or design projects can be approved. But in a way, we could also discuss and speak of ways in which, through the planning process, we can actually create and demand more possibilities for new forms of innovation and new forms of creativity for contemporary projects. So this is, in a way, instead of the kind of the approval process basically being based on a template of yes and no's, how can the planning process actually become the basis for encouraging new forms of creativity? So those are some of the things that hopefully will be clear. And I'll then try to be fairly quick. I don't think I have the energy of Spiro to go through as many slides. So it would be slower, but I'll try to stay on time. This image that I'm showing you is from an English engraver of the 18th century, William Hogarth. It's a very well-known engraving, and it's called Gin Lane. It's actually an engraving that was used in the 18th century to try and demonstrate the ill effects of drinking gin as opposed to drinking beer. And you see that this is what happens to you if you have too much hard liquor. Basically, people start behaving badly, and there is an implied relationship between the kind of codes of behavior within urban environments and, in a way, the health of the citizens and basically the quality of life of the city. I'm just showing you this image because when often we think about medieval cities or we think about old cities, there is this notion that in many instances the city is seen as a site, as a place that corrupts individuals, that is not the place of healthiness, that is not the place of health. And so this association in some ways between the kind of immoralities of the urban and the city as a site of these kinds of practices, I think has had a deep impact on the way in which then architecture and urbanization has responded to the way in which actually planning and design then developed as a set of practices. So in response to this notion of the city, we get towards the very end of the 19th century and the beginning of the 20th century, a whole set of ideas and movements, for example, towards the formation of what was called the Garden City movement, which you're very familiar with. One of the examples is the work of Ebenezer Howard, and what he tried to do, which is basically to try and create cities that were very close to the notion of gardens, to this mixture of urbanization and landscape, or urbanization and nature. And the fact that nature, in a sense, was seen from the period of Enlightenment onwards specifically to have this cleansing power, to be seen to be something that actually had a good effect. So if the city was the site of corruption, this idea of the garden city was the site of purification, and its proximity to nature was something that brought about extremely redeeming kind of feature. These sorts of characteristics are even very visible during an earlier period, for example, in the earlier part of the 19th century. Here, you might, when you look at this image, you might think that this is some palace, it's some mansion somewhere in the country, but in fact, this is one of a series of buildings that were built during the 19th century around one of London's parks, which is called Regent's Park. And a number of architects, such as Decimus Burton and others, were involved in building these kinds of buildings, which look like mansions, but actually they were individual houses or apartment buildings now, condominiums, that are masked, in a sense, behind this facade that looks like the mansion in the country. Now, what is important about this is that the people who were living in the city, they actually desired the life of country and wanted there to have this association, in a way, with the notion of country life. Because again, and this is deeply rooted in certain Protestant ethics, is this association with nature and naturalism. And therefore, we have a kind of lie, in a way, that's going on, which is this building that's not really a mansion, but pretending to be a mansion. And what is important about this kind of project is that it represents certain desires. It represents the desires of the people who are living in these houses to say what kind of a life do they want to have. And therefore, my point is that there has been always a very direct relationship between our desires and the kind of environments that we construct. today the minister was mentioning a brief reference to China. We could say that the way that urbanization and the way that the quality of life is evolving in China is deeply rooted in the desires of the Chinese. That's what they're after, and it's those desires that is actually driving, that's actually driving those societies to do the kinds of things that they're doing, to build the kinds of cities that they're doing, and that's not always good. It has good and bad side effects. So what we have to be really focused on is also what are the kinds of desires that we have, and what is the correlation between our desires and the kind of environments that we construct. This is just to demonstrate that what you saw in the 19th century and what you saw at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century is become a kind of continuous project where in 1925, a very, very well-known architect, Le Corbusier, also developed, for example, many plans. This is one called Plan Voisin from 1925, which shows the notion of high-rise structures in the middle of parks, in the middle of landscapes. And this, in a way, is a very similar thing to what I showed you before with the idea of the mansions in relation to nature, because what is it doing? It's saying, we don't want the medieval city anymore. The notion of the radical modernist city is the city where high-rise apartments exist in the midst of nature, and nature, therefore, has that capacity for cleansing and purification. And this also, of course, is seen in the work of other architects like Frank Lloyd Wright. He built this, he developed this project called Broadacre City based on the role of the automobile and the notion that his city, Broadacre City, was a kind of antithesis of a city. It was an anti-city, and basically it was in many ways based on the desire for suburbia and wanting to live in the suburbs. So today we have a situation where we are also the inheritors of this tradition, and I want to argue that the continuity of this kind of desire for suburbia is something that is still very present in projects like Celebration in Florida, that kind of development, and there are many, many others like it, which basically still continues to represent a kind of preference for suburban lifestyle. But the fact of the matter is that today we really need to think about alternative models of urbanization than the suburban model of urbanization, because partly with suburban models of urbanization you also inherit many problems connected to sprawl, one of which is of course problems related to many of the things that were discussed this morning about resources, about energy, but also of course around questions of health and obesity and lots of other things. So that's one train of thought. What are the relationship between urbanization and suburbia, and what does that mean in terms of, for example, EXUMAS or as far as the Bahamas is concerned? Because I feel that in the context of places like Bahamas, we of course are able to and have to focus more on housing and less probably on models of urbanization. Therefore, it would be interesting to discuss the interrelationship between models of urbanization which incorporate and include housing, as well as those that may perhaps not. And there are certain sort of repercussions about that that I think are worth discussing. The other thing is really this question of water urbanization, and what does it mean to be designing things that are close to water. And I'm just showing you this slide of Venice basically as a kind of as a sort of marker. It's not that I'm going to say anything terribly profound about this, but I think that we really still have to discuss the possibilities for water urbanization, that it's not only in relation to the sustainability conversation, but about the conceptualization, the ideas for the kinds of things that are possible. Precisely, this is the kind of question that the Qataris are concerned with. We had this tradition before, we're now building high-rises. What could be the possibility of a different kind of urbanization that's neither a replication of the old, nor is it simply the high-rise? And just, when we start doing things that might have connection with water, it becomes much more a sort of horizontal project. It becomes much more a sprawl type of project. And therefore, the question of how density is really reflected in the way in which we think about our process of urbanization becomes a key part of this. We are imagining this amazing landscape of the EXUMAS, but the reality is, in other parts of the world, people are living in this kind of buildings. This is Kowloon Wall City, and you can just imagine the condition of densification that exists in a place like this. And not that I'm suggesting that the Bahamas has to deal with the level of density of something like Kowloon, but I think it's important in terms of the future to have a certain sense of the reality of the issue of density and what that could mean as a way of preventing sprawl. So that is an interesting conversation, because in many parts of the world, this is precisely what is happening. In the foreground, you see the old city. In the background, you see the new city. You have to deal with this dilemma of how to transform the old city and how to, in a sense, build the new city. The old city, in many instances, has to deal with these lots and lots of problems of environmental pollution, of the quality of life for the inhabitants. And all these things are, of course, part of not only the question of resources, but in a way relate to the whole sort of range of the amazing growth that we have in many parts of the world, where you see a city that develops from 1973 to the year 2000, from the image on the left to the one on the right. Or the way that you see in parts of the world the disappearance, in a way, of the natural lakes from the image on the left to the image on the right, from 1976 to the year 2007. All of these issues related to the question of resources, in many instances, may seem like that they are very far away, but they're actually very close. And I mentioned this morning, and I think a number of other people have discussed this, about this question of the issue of distance and proximity, of globality and locality. And a few years ago, there were 3 little articles in the English newspaper, The Guardian, one day, the same day. And the first one was by this Canadian writer, Naomi Klein, who wrote about tar sands in Canada and the relationship between the war in Iraq and the development of tar sands in Alberta, Canada, basically trying to demonstrate that it was the war in Iraq that actually made the tar sands in Canada profitable. And something that was happening thousands of miles away was having a deep physical impact on the landscape of Canada, in terms of how it was devastating, in some sense, that landscape. I think we exist in this kind of world today where we may not be deliberately responsible for things that actually happen to us, basically because of that question of distance and relationship. This was another story that happened in the paper, which was really this house that was being built, and many of you have seen this thing. It's a 60-plus story house that was built, is finished now, by the Ambani family in Mumbai. Basically, this is for a very small family of about 6 or 7 people who are living they have now turned it into something, I think, like a 27-story building, but it's actually consists of almost 60 plus stories. And I think it raises if the first one was about distance and proximity, this one is about the limits and ethics of what is enough and what constitutes a house, and what should be the limits of what we use as resources. And the third story was this story about an allotment in the city of Liverpool in England, where a psychiatrist is using the allotment to bring together a lot of immigrants from various parts of the world, many of them from war-torn parts of the world, together with the local community who are basically cultivating these allotments. So each one of them would have a piece of the allotment. And I think the point of this allotment, and these two guys who are standing in this photograph are people who actually made a movie about this experience, basically demonstrated that the allotment was a kind of catalyst for establishing relationships between these people from various parts of the world. The reason I mention this is because of the fact that when we are talking about collaboration amongst ourselves and collaboration amongst the community, it actually helps to have some specific catalyst, to have some very specific elements, physical things that can be the devices for sharing, because it makes it a lot easier to share through something rather than to have, for example, a philosophical discussion in abstraction, as opposed to discussing something concretely about this site or this house or this landscape. And this kind of allotment idea was very useful in a way in constructing a certain set of relationships between the immigrant community and the local community. And in a way, when we think about the future of any part of the EXUMAS, this notion of the catalyst is very important. And this is basically the background to the discussions around ecological urbanism and the idea of trying to bring ecology and urbanization together, which you have in that pamphlet that we handed out. And basically, the argument would be that if we are going to think about making new kinds of projects, we also need to design the framework through which we design these projects. It's not like we as designers feel that we're the kinds of doctors who know everything there is about any kind of conceivable disease, but that we really need to also be prepared to design and orchestrate the mechanisms for the production of work as much as we are thinking about the actual work itself. And that relationship between the circumstances for doing the work and the outcome is important. And so if, for example, we're discussing a research project related to the EXUMAS, the concept of designing the framework for that research, for that thinking, is something that is being shown on this slide, in the sense that you have to anticipate, you have to imagine certain things, you have to collaborate in specific ways, you have to deal with new forms of sensibility, the role of curation becomes important, how you produce things, it's very important, concepts of mobility and transportation are important. So these are really in a sense, and this is not trying to suggest that this is the end of it. In a way, this is proposing that whoever is working on issues actually needs to suggest the framework for the development of ideas. And these set of words are basically trying to put that forward. One of the themes that runs through the whole conversation about ecological urbanization, about sustainability and the urban, is really the attitude or the relationship to garbage, is to trash. Most of our cities produce phenomenal amounts of garbage, and basically my point, and a lot of other people have talked about, is that we're not just dealing with a physical problem of how do we deal with this garbage, but that actually dealing with this garbage is also dealing, in a sense, with a sort of cultural issue, that the understanding of what kind of garbage we produce, because we see a lot of data about the quantity of garbage that is produced within different cultures. But my point is that we actually have to deal with garbage also as a sort of cultural project, as anthropologists who look at this garbage and decide or discuss what does this garbage actually say about ourselves, to the point that you see that New York City every hour produces something equivalent of the size of the Statue of Liberty in terms of garbage. So part of it is what you do. And so I'm just going to run through some examples to suggest that we actually need to imagine different ways of dealing with what are normally thought of as functional problems, and see those as new kinds of opportunities to actually be able to think about this point of the question that was asked this morning about innovation, about creativity, about the role of design, about what I was saying before, about the mechanisms for evaluating work. This is the work of someone who has actually been teaching at the school, a Danish architect, Bjarke Engel, who together with one of the engineers at the GSD recently won this competition for an incinerator in Denmark, where basically it's a functional building for an incinerator, but it's also a ski slope on the outside. And you take, in a sense, a kind of absolutely mundane, totally functional building, and you turn it also into something pleasurable. So the relationship between things that are often thought to be ugly, that are thought to be purely functional, but actually they might have, in a sense, a sort of byproduct that would be interesting. This is a project which has been built in Spain, which is really like an air filter in the middle of the city, but it's also a kind of sculptural piece that has plants and all of that growing in the middle of it. So how this idea of thinking about urban monuments or thinking about places in the city might serve different kinds of functions. Closer to home here, many of you maybe have seen recently the completion of this garage building in Miami, done by a developer that took an existing building and basically asked the Swiss practice of Herzog & de Meuron to turn it into a kind of multifunctional building that has an apartment, you can still park cars in it, it has a gallery, and therefore, again, the functional use of the garage is now turned into something which has become more like a public building. And so this idea of how we are able to imagine things in a different way is really one of the big challenges. In France, for example, many years ago, instead of thinking about a public park as being something that's just designed as a landscape, they used the idea of agricultural landscape or the notion of an agricultural territory as the basis of designing the park. So the idea is that productive landscapes, things that produce things, can also have an aesthetic value. We shouldn't just think about things that are being designed as having aesthetic value. So that here, for example, these are salt marshes, salt pools that basically I think are also very beautiful landscapes. They have aesthetic qualities as landscapes, but actually they were never designed as anything of a landscape. So my point is, what can we learn from things that were not intended to be visually pleasing, but nevertheless they have a visual dimension? And so the responsibility, for example, of public and private partnership projects becomes quite interesting in terms of how one can take infrastructural projects and also turn them into potentially aesthetic projects, projects that really have benefit for the social good. There is an Italian architect called Andrea Branzi who's done a lot of work on agricultural territory. Going back to the point about senses, this is a lady from Scandinavia who uses smells to document the smells of different cities. This happens to be Mexico City. This is the idea that most of the development around the world will actually happen to relate to the water urbanization. I'm just going to run through these because I realize that we have run out of time and we have to have our panel. But you see that these ideas that everyday places and everyday projects could actually be much more visually enticing is basically the point that I'm trying to make. This is a group that leaves pianos around various cities, and people play the piano, and the playing of the piano becomes a device for people gathering around the player and then having conversations. This is a kind of reiteration of my point about how one needs catalysts for interaction, for participation. So these are all about ways in which you create innovations and new frameworks for urbanization. This is a case of an old railway line, disused line in Paris called Promenade Plantée that was taken by the city and turned into an amazing landscape. Here I would make the point about the benefits of bottom-up urbanization in parts of Africa. And with this final slide, I would make the point about the relevance, in a way, of this idea of the aesthetics of productive landscapes, and how when we are thinking about our cities, whether we are thinking about the Bahamas or whether we are thinking about the EXUMAS, these projects are constantly bound up in a certain set of aesthetic projects that are very close to our ethical attitudes towards these kinds of places. And therefore, whenever we think about these projects, we have to constantly bear in mind the idea of the kind of division of the sorts of possibilities and the kinds of projects that we can create for them in the future. Thank you very much. Thank you.